When she was munching and crunching on some dude's flesh, I was literally like that meme of the woman going, good for her. Welcome to yet another video where I will be racing against the sun creeping into my living room. This will definitely be a challenge because I want to talk about 10 most recent books that I have read, and just from past experience I can be a yapper when it comes to books. 3 of them were horror books that I enjoyed for different reasons. 5 of them were romantasy books where some were a hit, some were not, and some were labeled as romantasy, but I would personally disagree. Plus a graphic novel and a depressing nonfiction book per my repertoire. Hopefully you will find a book that's interesting to you, but I think a great way to seek out further book recommendations would be from Book of the Month, which is a sponsor of today's video. Their mission is to bring the best new fiction forward, so every month they go through hundreds of book titles and curate at least 5 books for you to choose from to be delivered to your door. So in my case, I got Red City as well as Hazelthorn. I was definitely in a fantasy kind of mood this month, and I like that this is both an adult fantasy and a YA fantasy, so I can have the best of both worlds. But they have tons of other genres like literary, romance, thrillers, and that's why I genuinely love their service, because I get to find out about books that I would have never known about otherwise. This month, you can get your first box for $5 plus a free hat of your choosing. For me, I chose the one that says Unreliable Narrator. To get this deal, all you gotta do is click on the link in my description and use the code CANDY, and then you can have a really great selection of books and hats to choose from for only $5. Again, what an amazing deal. This is literally why they are one of my favorite services, because they always got something cooking. So now let's move on to other books that were cooking in my brain for the past 2 months. I'm gonna divide this based on genre instead of chronological order. Now I'm gonna start with horror because we are approaching spooky season now. Spooky because it's Halloween on the 31st and my birthday on the 17th, and I do find aging to be a scary thing. Like, I can feel my body deteriorating already as I become decrepit. But you know what's another body horror that really slapped for me? That is You Weren't Meant to Be Human. And this is a horror novel that takes place in rural West Virginia after an alien invasion. We have this unique grim atmosphere going on where there is a bunch of masses of worms and flies that have taken root across different areas of Virginia. But at the same time, the story is very contained and it focuses more so on the main character's conflict and personal journey. So you're not really getting like background lore of how this alien invasion came to be or what the rest of society looks like now, but it's like this very contained, magnified look at this one specific area in Virginia and the main character, who is one of the followers for the Hive. And the Hive is basically like this weird festering mass of flies and worms that have dominance over these humans that are, you know, trying to survive on Earth. And if you pledge loyalty to the Hive, there are certain benefits that come with it. One of them is survival, but for the main guy's case, it is also being able to live more of like an authentic life than he had before. Now in this new world, he's able to transition when previously in the world before, he had to live life as a girl. He has all kinds of internal struggles going on, mainly with a lot of self-loathing, and you can see that from the ways that he self-sabotages constantly. He basically becomes like fuck buddies with this other guy who's a follower of the Hive, and this guy treats him like crap and has rough sex with him to the point of pain. In the main guy's mind, he feels like, number one, at least he can feel like a man and feel wanted by this hyper masculine macho ex-marine dude. But then also number 2, it satisfies that self-loathing and hatred that he has for himself when another person treats him like crap. The real kicker that sets this whole story is when he finds out that he is pregnant from the asshole guy that he has been hooking up with, and the Hive that they have been loyal followers to demand him to keep the child and go through the pregnancy. That's where the body horror really becomes personal, because first of all, I have always viewed the process of childbirth to be like body horror. But with this kind of book, there are layers to it, right? Because the main character is a transgender man and he doesn't even want to have this kid. So it adds to the gender dysmorphia that he feels and the hopelessness and lack of agency of someone who has to be forced to give birth. Much like a lot of people who don't have access to abortions or can't have an abortion for whatever reason. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the prose most was like how visceral and disgusting and gross it was. Not just from the weird worms and flies that are like festering all over the place, but even just like the process of the main character's body changing and describing the childbirth in such like a horrific way. And also like the emotional turmoil that happens when you are forced to be in this very shitty situation, but like the self-loathing that comes from he had a family and he had friends that he cut off for the sake of committing to this life. And so in a way, he is accountable for his own self-sabotage. The themes were just like really well done and fully concentrated in the book that I just very much appreciated, and I thought it was very well done. And then another horror book that I read is called What Hunger, and this is a coming of age tale following the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants, and it dabbles into a little cannibalism here, hence the title. Basically, in the summer before the main girl starts high school, she loses her older brother in a tragic accident, and the family really feels this loss very deeply. There are obviously ways that like immigrant parents deal with tragedy in ways that are not healthy. And so I felt a lot of sympathy for the main girl because she was clearly grieving and lonely while her mom was like checked out and her dad was just drinking his problems away, which, by the way, an alcoholic father is very accurate Vietnamese representation. If you know, you know. And they don't talk about their problems. That's another accurate Vietnamese representation right there. And so that adds to the isolation that the main girl feels. And so with the horror element of her dabbling into cannibalism, I could understand how she got to that point. Grief makes you do some crazy shit. And when you don't have support from your family and from school, and you have asshole white people inflicting danger upon you, one of them being rape, which is something I'm only telling you as a trigger warning, I can understand the initial chomping of the flesh as a way of retaliation and protection, but then having that bloodthirst because in a way that's like the only time you can have control or feel like you have some kind of power in what otherwise is a very powerless position. And I think also the parallels to her parents' experience like immigrating from Vietnam and dealing with poverty and communism ties the concept of eating meat into that cultural past, because for a while people in Vietnam were denied from eating meat. The parents do not speak about the shit that went down in Vietnam, but they do enforce the idea of meat being a dangerous luxury because to them it is a symbol of survival and it shouldn't be taken for granted because it was such a scarce resource. So a lot of the things that the story evokes felt true to me. For example, the family dynamics felt real with how distant it was. She's a young girl struggling with a lot of things internally, and her parents are physically there, but they're not really there, you know? And I felt like a lot of the family scenes almost felt like nonfiction to me sometimes. Like that's how real it felt. I also thought that the female rage felt real, and I think that's very important to nail down when you are trying to get your reader to suspend their disbelief that some person is gonna go down the path of cannibalism. The small gripe that I do have with it though is that I do think that the ending felt anticlimactic. We were leading up to some grand thing, and I was ready for the journey because, listen, when she's fucking chomping on these people, I'm like, you know what? You're going through enough, so you go ahead and do it. When she was munching and crunching on some dude's flesh, I was literally like that meme of the woman going, good for her. So I feel like it was leading up to something, but then we got to the end, and then I was like, oh, is that it? I was kind of surprised that it just ended there. Another thing that kicked in within the last 3 chapters was the mother-daughter relationship, which was a nice development, but I realized that the synopsis for the book mentions that this is about generational trauma and mother-daughter bonding. So I totally get, you know, the generational trauma part, the female rage part, the child of immigrant parents part, but I didn't get mother-daughter bonding because it happened, in my point of view, kind of last minute in the book. I did not know that it was supposed to be about a mother-daughter relationship until I got to the end, and my friend that I was buddy reading with said that the summary had indicated mother-daughter relationship. I feel like you should either just cut that part out entirely and not pretend that, it's gonna be like that, or incorporate it much earlier so it doesn't feel like it's something that's tacked on at the end. That being said, I still enjoyed listening to the audiobook and going along with this very depressed, angsty girl. Real recognize real, what can I say? The other horror book that I read was Lucky Day, and this is probably like the weirdest, quirkiest horror book that I have read because it's not really traditional horror. It's very like zany that I think only an author like Chuck Tingle could pull off. The main character is a statistics professor whose world gets upended literally when she is caught in this very terrifying, basically apocalyptic event that's called the low probability event. Millions of people around the world end up dying in really strange, bizarre, and extremely unlikely ways. And so since then, she has not found any meaning in life at all, because not only is she grieving over the loss of her mom and the trauma of seeing a bunch of people die and like this very traumatic event in general, it's also like, what can you really believe in anymore when nothing actually makes sense? It's basically like how random and silly and improbable the deaths were in the Final Destination movies, but I would argue that this book has more substance to it. Despite how absurd the deaths are, it goes more into the existentialism in a way that kind of reminded me of Everything Everywhere All at Once. Like, that's literally the character development that the main character has to experience. There's one side of things where you think nothing matters, but because nothing matters, we have to choose the things that do matter to us. And that's like the whole emotional journey that she has to deal with while going through the physical main plot that's going on, which is her teaming up with a government agent to investigate this lucky casino in Las Vegas that may be connected to the catastrophe. And so I was reminded a lot of Everything Everywhere All at Once because of that messaging with existentialism, and like, because nothing matters, there's almost like a radical nature of having hope or optimism in trying to make things matter in your life. Also, like the absurdity of things as well, because nothing matters. Usually when I read or watch stories where a bunch of like random zany shit happens, it doesn't always hit for me because I don't like things to be random for the sake of being random. What I ended up liking about this book is that it was rooted in this kind of message and heart that the author gave to it. And also like the mystery that was going on with the casino and how it might be connected to catastrophe was interesting as like the main plot as well. I would be really interested to see a movie adaptation of this book, purely just so that I can take an edible and watch it and just have like my mind be like, what the fuck is going on? Now, as my living room gets hotter, let me scooch over and go into the romantasy books that I have read. And I'm gonna start off with my favorite of the group, which is gonna be When the Tides Held the Moon. The comp titles for this book was basically The Greatest Showman meets The Shape of Water. And this is probably like the most accurate comp titles I've ever seen in the book, because the story was exactly that. It takes place in 1910s New York City in this sideshow carnival environment on Coney Island. The main character is a blacksmith who's working at the carnival, and he becomes more involved in the very eclectic cast of the show. You have people who are similar characters to the ones on The Greatest Showman, where because of like their absurdities or physical deformities or just general differences with the rest of society, that has been capitalized to be a show where people can ogle at them. Now, one of the newest characters that's going to be added to the cast of freaks that are in this circus sideshow thing is this merman that the guy who's running the carnival has captured. The main guy, as he's working for the evil capitalist owner, is also tasked with the duty of, looking after the merman and making sure he doesn't escape from the tank. They start to form this friendship that also develops into love, because even though they come from very different backgrounds, they're still able to connect in the sense of like both feeling like outsiders in their own way. Obviously, we know the reasons why for the merman being stuck in the cage, but the main guy is a Puerto Rican immigrant who had to start over in New York City and has had to deal with a really rough upbringing, trying to make a life for himself and never really having a home of his own where he can truly belong in. And so as they get closer and develop romantic feelings, like obviously this guy doesn't want this person that he loves to be trapped in his cage forever. But if he were to release the merman, not only is he going to have the consequences of pissing off the evil, powerful capitalist overlord, but that's also going to fuck up his new gig with his job that he needs and his found family that also needs this job, because the sideshow is basically declining and the merman is like their last resort and be able to keep everyone's jobs. So there are a lot of stakes involved for this. This felt like such a big blockbuster movie to me. Like, this is a story that I wish could have been made into a movie instead of The Greatest Showman. I personally wasn't very impressed with that movie, but I think that this story would have been so much better while still having like the mass appeal as The Greatest Showman. It has a diverse cast, it has a sweeping romance, and the setting of historical Coney Island is its own character as well. Like, the setting is so important and interwoven throughout how the scenes are described and how the characters have lived their lives and the hardships that they've had to face during this time period and the specific environment, the ways that they speak and the clothes that they wear and the culture that they have. Like, you can tell that the author did a lot of research with making sure that the setting felt as authentic as possible. There was a lot of time that was put into developing the romance between the characters. There was a lot of buildup of the trust and connection that the two characters had with each other. Because one of the gripes that I have when I read romantasy books is that people too quickly dive into the romance part. And listen, I am a girly that loves a good romance, but you gotta build up to it. I gotta understand how they got to that point of being willing to risk their lives for each other. The author really took their time in making sure that these two main characters had specific interactions and deep conversations and little micro interactions that would get them to that point, other than just simply being attracted to one another. And I also think like the cherry on top of this is that it has these illustrations interspersed throughout the book, because the author also happens to be an illustrator, and they even illustrated the cover of the book. And now another book that I read with an author who is so unfairly talented at both writing and illustrating is a debut that came out this year called House of the Beast. This is a dark fantasy about a young woman. She had a very difficult upbringing. First of all, she was born as like a bastard child, and so as a result, she and her mom were shunned by society. But in the beginning of the book, when you're following her as a child, her mom becomes very sick. She reaches out to her estranged father and writes a message to him begging for help, because he is this guy who is extremely powerful, basically the head of a noble family that serves the gods and have these powers. And so he, in his position of privilege and power, surely would be able to help her sick mother. In exchange for her mom getting access to medicine, the main girl agrees to sacrifice her left arm to the beast, which is basically this god and harbinger of death that her father is a vessel to. So she will make that sacrifice and bind herself to the house that he runs. Unfortunately, very early on in the book, and even stated so in the summary itself, so this is not a spoiler, okay? That effort basically was a waste of time because the mom passes away anyway. And now she's stuck in the grand estate with other relatives that hate her ass because she's just like the bastard kid. And now she has to be a pawn for whatever schemes her asshole dad is up to. What else do you have? The only person in your family died because your asshole dad didn't do shit. And now you only have one fucking arm. So the only thing you really do have is an imaginary best friend, as a child would have when they are lonely and sad and have nothing else going on. But she is surprised to find that this imaginary friend that she has is a real person. He is a monster who shows up in the form of a handsome boy. He says, you know, I see you, I understand where you're coming from, and you and we are gonna plan to wreak havoc on all these bitches together, and I'm gonna be by your side no matter what, as your ride or die. His character is definitely the most interesting to me throughout this whole story because, first of all, there's like this contrast between his outer appearance, which is like a beautiful prince with starlit hair and a very easygoing demeanor, but the reality being that he is a monster and harbinger of death and is ready to like kill a bunch of bitches. And they have like a very codependent kind of relationship. And it's not good for them in the grand scheme of things, but like, I get it when you're a lonely bitch. And so this is a book I would argue should not be categorized as a romantasy. Like the main guy expresses romantic interest in her, but I don't think it was really about the romance. I think it was more so the main character's quest for vengeance, but then also her having to grapple with like the question of whether vengeance is the right thing to do. I don't know. I very much feel like their relationship was more so for the sake of her character development and for her to figure out at the end of the day what is important for her in her life. And he just represents something that she badly wants and her darkest desires, and she has to choose whether, you know, it's worth pursuing it or not. I think the one thing that I wish had been pushed further is the argument for wanting to do good, because that's like the thing that the main character has to have that internal battle over. Are we gonna succumb to being a hateful bitch because the world has done us so dirty, so everybody here deserves to die? Or should we try to be a good person? And I think I would have found that push and pull dilemma that she had to be more, I guess, believable or have more stakes if I truly couldn't decide between the two. Well, I don't know if this just says who I am as a person, but all right, my camera died right when I was starting to look really bad for what I was about to say. Again, I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like when you're grappling between vengeance versus being a good person, and the only reason why you might want to consider being a good person is because your dead mom once told you to be good, I personally feel like that's not a good enough reason for me. Sorry. Maybe that just says more about me. I guess this is why I should be glad that I never had an imaginary best friend that turned out to be a death god who would try to lure me into the dark side, because I guess I could go there quite easily. And we find out his background story and his lore towards the end of the book, and I found that to be quite compelling as well. That actually made me more invested in his character and be like, you know, you making some good points. And so that is why I should not be the main character for these kinds of stories. All right, so then the next book that I read was The Enemy's Daughter, and this one is a true romantasy because it actually does fit the category. Like, it's a fantasy, but the plot is very heavily romance, and this is enemies to lovers specifically. It is young adult. It's set in a dystopian world with magic, and it is a reimagining of Tristan and Isolde, which I am not familiar with, so I just read it at like face value. Basically, in this world, there are two settlements that are fighting for control of this land. One of them are 5 clans, and then there's the King's Land. There's a war that's going on because the 5 clans have killed the King's Land's leader. The main girl is a healer for the side of the clans, while the main guy works as a King's Land assassin. And their paths cross when she's trying to stop an attack that he's enforcing upon her side, but then his soldiers shoot her with a poisoned arrow. But surprisingly, instead of letting her die, he offers to save her life using this rare magic. This magic binds the two of them together where they can experience each other's emotions and memories and perspectives on a practical level. This means that they can try to get knowledge from each other's minds and memories so that they can find out how to destroy each other's side. But on an impractical level, them starting to be more attracted to each other and fall for each other muddles the whole thing altogether. I think what would have made this story hit more for me is if it really leaned more into like the calculating side of things, because you really do have a pool of knowledge that you can take advantage of for your enemy. I know that this is an enemies to lover stories, but I would have wanted more emphasis on the enemies side of things, especially on the individual level. Politically, I understand why they're enemies because they're literally on opposite sides of the war. When it comes to them being individuals, I feel like it just would have been juicier if they like individually were ready to fucking take each other down. This could have been a cool opportunity to lean into like the political intrigue and like, I don't know, some mental chess game that they could have had with each other, and then have it become juicier when they fall in love and while continuing to play these mind games. Something I realized I'm not a fan of until I read this book is the trope where the main character is a girl who is unaware of her family's evil, shitty politics. And I understand the function for this kind of trope for character development, because actually this is quite a problem in real life. There are people deeply entrenched in propaganda or how they were raised and taught by their family. But I think it's not as fun for me to read about when I, the reader, already know that your family probably ain't shit. Because then it kind of just feels like I'm waiting for this clueless girl to wake the fuck fuck up and get her shit together. So I think it would have been more compelling if I had been given a lot of reason to believe in the propaganda as she is, and then be just as surprised as she is when she learns the truth. But I think there were so many indicators in the beginning for why her side of the war probably ain't shit. One of them being the sexism that was going on for her side of things, where she is a healer and not expected to be a fighter or get involved with men's affairs on account of her being a woman, which is something that I've always found to be strange in fantasy stories, because this is a fantasy. You don't necessarily have to subscribe to real life sexism, but I don't know if maybe that is just a part of the original retelling. Either way, when people on her side of the war are telling her and her mom that women should basically stay where they are and metaphorically stay in the kitchen, I'm like, I kind of feel like you guys are probably the bad guys in the war. I don't know, just a hunch. Usually sexism is a common feature for these kinds of things. And then the next two romantasy books also overlap with dark academia, starting with Immortal Consequences. This is a young adult debut that takes place in a boarding school that also happens to be at the edge of the afterlife. The people who go to the school are basically teenagers who have died for whatever reason and are now stuck in purgatory and are spending the rest of eternity having to guide lost souls on their way to death. I too would find this to be a grim fate, because what do you mean that I am dead and now you're putting me back to school and now I gotta spend the rest of eternity being at school? Absolutely not. So one of the ways that you can get out of this situation is by entering the decennial, which is basically a once in a decade celebration where nominees can compete against each other in a series of trials. And if you're able to pass the trials, you can choose between graduating and joining the school's magical elite, or you can cross over to the mysterious other side, which is presumed to be basically moving on to the afterlife, but that's not really guaranteed for sure. So we follow 6 students who all have their own background stories and their own reasons for why they want to cross over to the other side or join the school's elite. I definitely think we need more fun YA fantasy like that. And another fun part about the book was having 6 perspectives to follow too. But I think that can be hard to pull off, because there are certain characters where I might gravitate more towards, and then there are others where I don't necessarily care about their storylines, or I'm not getting enough to be invested in what's going on with them. Because I'm a basic bitch, I was more invested in the main 2 characters that obviously have some kind of romantic thing going on. They are academic arch rivals, and you can tell that the main guy's down bad for her, and so that's also my bias for why I was invested more in them. The main thing that I wish the book did more of is show us the characterization and the relationship of these 6 students that we have here. It's established that they already know each other, and so when they talk to each other, they say things like, "You've always acted this way," or "You and I both know that we feel this way for one another." And I'm like, okay, but can you guys show me this though? Like, I don't want to be told this through dialogue. It's a big challenge to try to show these relationships in a way that's not just like telling through conversations. And I wonder if having more flashbacks would have helped with that, or if that would have slowed down the story if we have too many flashbacks, because we already were getting flashbacks about their past lives when they were alive and how they died and came to this place. But I think because this is a series, maybe the future books will expand more on the relationships and the background stories so that it feels a little bit more complete. And that brings me to a sequel that I read next called A Theory of Dreaming. This is a sequel to A Study in Drowning, which I read I think about a year or 2 years ago. This was back when I used to rate books, and I really enjoyed the writing for A Study in Drowning enough to rate it 5 stars, because I thought that the prose was really effective. Thematically, it was really strong in the sense of like showing how women's stories were being hidden from history and how women can try to reclaim their stories through not only the main character, but like the bigger plot that was going on. So the first book follows an architecture student who enters a contest to redesign the estate of her favorite author, and then she ends up investigating his legacy along her academic rival and literature student, and they have like a rivals to lovers romance going on. So in the sequel, you see more of their relationship now that this romance has been established. The main character becomes the first woman to enroll in a literature college, but she has to deal with a lot of scrutiny that the whole school is holding against her, because now that she and the main guy have exposed the author's legacy from the first book, people are not happy with that. Some of them are doubting her claims, because who would believe a woman? And a lot of people think that she is just trying to like cause a fuss to ruin this guy's legacy, because he is someone who was very respected in the community. So because the main girl is going through shit, the main guy naturally feels very protective and angry on her behalf, and he starts dreaming of a palace under the sea and this world where where he is a king. These dreams get really trippy and they start to come to life even in his waking hours. As much as I enjoyed the first book, the sequel unfortunately didn't quite hit for me. I found it to be a shame that despite their relationship now being established, they were very distant from each other emotionally because, like, obviously they cared about each other and wanted to protect one another, but they weren't communicating for shit. They were like lost in the sauce of their own emotions and problems, and they were very angsty and melodramatic, thinking about how their existence was a burden and they shouldn't share this thing with the other person and burden them even more. And I'm like, y'all need to stop with all of this hand wringing and just talk to each other. They were constantly thinking about how terrible they were and how their existence was a burden to the world. And I was like, girl, you're a lit major, you know, like it's okay. Just do your homework. I just couldn't really connect with the angst, even though, you know, I am someone who also tends to magnify my own problems and self-hatred. And I also will constantly beat myself up over things. And even then I'm like, you guys, we don't need to go down this path. And if we are, the very least that we can do is communicate with each other now that we have a romantic partner who has been through the ringer with you and can understand where you're coming from. I would rather have just one book that is done really well than continue the story in more than one book, but not really expand it any further. The next book that I wish we actually had more of, though, is gonna be a graphic novel that I read called The Sword of Malimani. Basically, it follows a 10-year-old boy who lives in the northern tribe and wants to prove himself. There's a ceremony that he gets banned from, which is very upsetting to him because that was going to be a way for him to be an adult in the eyes of his people. And so he takes matters into his own hands by running off on his own to this forbidden forest to prove that he is totally capable of taking care of himself. By the way, this kid is 10. So I'm like, hello, CPS? In this forbidden forest, he stumbles upon this legendary weapon, and the premise seems to set up the story for him to go through a dangerous land of different gods and men and beasts in order to keep the sword of Malimani from the hands of the bad guys, which I don't really know enough lore about to go more into detail about this story. It was very, very short. You literally just saw him run away to the forest, find the sword, and that was it. So this is like one of the many reasons why I don't rate books anymore, because it's like, I feel like I wasn't even given enough of the story to rate in the first place. I know that there is like a volume 2, but I wish that the artist just combined the 2 volumes together to make it more of like a proper story to really chew with. And then the last book that I'm going to cover is a nonfiction book called The Inevitable, and this is about assisted suicide. The establishment of these programs is a controversial topic for a lot of people because some people think that it is a necessary program to have for people who would be suffering otherwise if they were to continue to live, whereas other people are against the existence of these programs because you can make the argument that these programs are just a band-aid for systemic issues that are going on rather than trying to resolve the issues in the first place. This became a topic of interest to me when I read some nonfiction books last year from disabled authors that were talking about this. They were against assisted suicide because their argument is generally like, why is it that you are against suicide for people in general, but then when it comes to disabled people, you have some kind of inherent belief that their lives are not as significant as other people's lives because of their disability, and that it's better for them to die. And so when I saw that this kind of book existed, I was interested in diving further into it because this author is a journalist who decided to use this book to focus on 6 people representing different aspects of the debate. One of them is a physician who has actually written more lethal prescriptions than anyone else in the US. And another person is someone who actually lost his medical license for teaching people how to end their lives painlessly and peacefully at DIY death workshops. The other 4 people that we learn about are people who had wanted to die because they were suffering from either old age or chronic illness or dementia or just like mental anguish, and so they saw suicide as their only option. So we're covering people who are in Australia, North America, and Europe, and I found this book to be both compelling and thought-provoking, but at the same time, I also wanted more from it because these stories are basically about patients and doctors that are pro-assisted suicide, and I really wish that we had more perspectives from people who were against it, especially when it comes to disabled people. people. I guess if anything, the book does give me more reasons on the opposite side of things for why people do this, like as a way of reclaiming agency or trying to die with dignity or just trying to feel like they have more control over their lives and their bodies. And so that's why I have a lot of mixed feelings about the topic, because I understand the principles against it. I think the disabled writers that I've read made such compelling arguments against why we shouldn't set this precedent of assisted suicide, because in a way we're kind of just like failing these people by letting them die instead of actively trying to improve the quality of their lives while they're here. But on the other hand, I, as someone who is very cynical and hopeless in many ways and, you know, deal with major depressive disorder, with the systems that we have right now in this world and with my brain being the way that it is, I know on a logical level, this doesn't actually solve the issue, but we're not going to solve the issue in our lifetimes. So what is one to do during these very trying times? It's a very bleak kind of mentality to get into. But overall, my impression is that if this book were to be more balanced, I definitely think there should have been more perspectives that were against it and not just people that were for it. And so that wraps up the 10 books that I have read. Let me know if any of these books sounded interesting to you, or if you have read anything recently that has caught your attention. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up this video, and my next one is gonna be a deep dive into my querying process for how I got a literary agent for my novel. So if you're interested in that, tune in for next time. And until then, I will see you later. Bye.